Welcome to Framing the Business podcast, hosted by Dr. Alice Gordon Holloway. Let's dive into a candid conversation with top entrepreneurs and business leaders as they share how they have revolutionized their industries, disrupted traditional markets, and leveraged technologies to stay ahead. Let's innovate together with Framing the Business podcast.
Welcome to Framing the Business. I'm happy that you're here to see this interview today. I've had the pleasure and the opportunity to interview a friend of mine who's been in the energy business over 4 decades. He is actually one of the people who I've met years and years ago who's given me so much advice. His family started a janitorial company many years ago in Middletown, Ohio. He's actually in the gasoline and diesel fuel business right now. He's someone I met when I was in the energy and nuclear power industry, and I continue to call him a friend of mine. I am so happy to have the opportunity to have my friend on the program today talking about his business, none other than Mr. Steve Hightower with Hightowers Petroleum. Steve, how are you today?
Very good. How are you today?
Yes, I'm doing great, Steve. You know, I've been able to continue to follow your career path for so many years. You've been one of those people who've been able to sustain businesses year after year, and it's so successful. As a matter of fact, in the gasoline and fuel business, you've been able to maintain so many other businesses along the way as well. For those who have not had a chance to meet you or learn your story, can you tell me a little bit more about Hightowers Petroleum?
Well, Hightowers Petroleum Company is a company that I started, actually got my first contract in 1981. Found out that I actually had something and actually reincorporated it in 1984 under Hightowers Petroleum Company. I grew it from one contract, and that contract actually was a set aside that was the state of Ohio had at that particular time in 1981. And BP had the contract for about 32 years. And this affirmative action program through the state, House Bill 584, had just been enacted. But in 1982, when all of the government changed and the Democrats came in, they started setting aside different commodities in the state. One of those commodities happened to be fuel. And from that point, I went to BP and several others and found BP would not quote any of the minority companies. They figured that was their business and no one would be able to take it. But there's always a number two person who would like to have that business. So I found a supplier that would quote me, and my first contract was the entire state of Ohio. My business background was in the janitorial business. I was also selling commodities and items to Ford Motor Company at the time, industrial materials, but I really did not know anything about fuel. But what I did know was how to get a supplier, how to give a quote, invoice, and pay my bills. And that was my total function at the time and total knowledge of fuel. But however, I turned it into a business. And 42, 43 years later, we're now in every state in the U.S., selling to corporate America as a primary. Everybody from AT&T, Union Pacific. We have about 7 utilities, Ameren, Duke Energy, Vistra, and many others. And, private sector has been where we've landed and have been very focused into growing the business out from there.
Well, speaking of growing businesses, Steve, it's so exciting that you have a business that you've maintained and have grown in the same state that you were born in. That is really impressive. As a matter of fact, your parents started this business a long time ago. And what I find so important and so exciting is that Inc. magazine named your company a Black family-owned metropolitan petroleum company as a large billion-dollar or almost billion-dollar company. Now, I know you talked about the billion-dollar piece is not something that you traditionally would want to talk about, but we know for sure that $1 billion in revenue is not the same as $1 billion in your pocket, of course, but you already are making strides in that area. Now, I'm excited that you still own 100% of your company and you actually manage the business on a day-to-day basis with your family members. So you have been able to continue to have a successful, privately owned company right here in America. So that's really one of those things I'm excited about. What do you think about that?
Well, growing up in a family business, which happened to be in a janitorial business, I bought my father out in 1979, I believe, and then resold his company in 1982, which was the janitorial business. And, it's a business that when people go to bed at night, you're working on the weekends, and people are having fun, you're working. And it's one of those industries I never regret leaving, but it is an industry that taught me my business skills and skill sets. I think that in knowing how to do business and knowing that you have to really learn and become a student of the industry that you're working within, I chose to begin to learn the petroleum business. I got my start with set asides and looking for business that had minority participation, like the casino riverboats in Indiana as they were coming in. They had goals. We used to fill the casino riverboats. At that particular time, highway contractors were utilizing minority companies. We began to sell fuel to highway contractors in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. And those were days that gave me my foundation because it gave me the opportunity to learn the business. And then from there, I began to get involved with the associations. And I always say, probably the biggest and most important thing that one can do in any industry that they're in is to engage the association in which your industry is involved with, because that's where your competitors are, that's where your suppliers are, and believe it or not, that's also where your customers are. So, over a period of time, I was told when I first went to my first association, which was Sigma, that you need to come back at every time we have an event 4 times a year. You need to be there 4 times a year, and don't just come once a year and say that's it. And that was the best advice I had. And in doing that, I began to learn when they were learning. I was sitting next to people that eventually I began to have relationships. They went on skiing trips. I began to ski. I began to do dog sledding. I did hand gliding. All of these things that I'd never done before, I was doing it with them. But you know what that did? That was the relationship building that was necessary, to the degree that as I began to grow and I needed more resources, then they became a resource to me, because again, it came beyond that guy in the room to, oh, that's Steve.
Yeah.
And once you get to that point, now you got something going when they actually know who you are, and in many cases actually like who you are. But those were the basic building blocks. And I've seen other diverse companies show up from time to time, but they don't last, and they don't last for various reasons. And not all of those reasons are that they may have done something wrong, but it takes a long time to build up enough volume such that your bottom line is enough for you to feed your family and do other things. It's a very high barrier to entry.
Yeah.
And part of that is the industry itself. But the other part is the high capital requirement in order to enter the market as well.
Well, if you see me looking down, you probably know I'm looking at Steve in the camera here. But speaking of this, it's really exciting to talk about your book, Steve. Your book is called Fueling from Zero to $1 Billion, which is your newest book that's available right now on Amazon. There's a lot of history in this book. There's a lot of things in here that myself can take away from this, entrepreneurs can take away from this, and really take a deep dive into how business success can really be mastered from people who are really serious about entrepreneurship, as you have been for many, many years. As a matter of fact, as I was reading your book, there were a lot of things in there that made me understand more about your story, such as redlining of your family home when you were years and years ago trying to get a home in these different areas. There's also information about armed guards at your home as well. And years ago, you really wanted to kind of figure out how you can become a pilot. So in this book, you can really find out that there are some interesting tips in here about your oratorical skills and about your background, and more importantly, about the fortitude that you've had as a business owner to be successful. So I must tell you, I am so impressed and happy that today I have an opportunity to talk to you about your book, Fueling from Zero to $1 billion that's available right now on Amazon. And so you mentioned a lot of things in your book, Steve, but I want to talk about some of the aspects of government contracting and any advice you would offer for us who are trying to get into government contracting and learn more about that process.
Well, government contracts is in various levels. I mean, you've got federal government, you got state, and you have local. The state of Ohio is where I actually entered the industry, and that was because the state, being a public entity, provided that opportunity for minority companies to begin to be engaged with different industries, and petroleum happened to be one of those. However, everything in the public sector is very regulated. The difference in the public sector and the private sector is that people do what they want to do. And if they like you and you're providing them a service, then they can say, come on, let's get started. You don't have to go to a bid process, or, even if you have a bid process, they have the ability to sit down with you and say, we would like to talk about how we might be able to do, tweak your bid, these services. There's conversations that can be had in the private sector to the degree that you don't, it's not as strict as government. The other thing is that government programs come and they go. And, very early on, House Bill 584 was struck down through a lawsuit by a guy by the name of Croson. The J.E. Croson Company sued, and that came back to not just Ohio, but the entire country, that basically changed the way those programs were actually put in place. But in the meantime, those programs were put on hold. And when a program is put on hold, then those agencies no longer can contract under those particular provisions. So just like what we may be faced with today, if it's your business is strictly based off of DNI and a legislative program, and that is all of a sudden come to an end, then your business might be, faltered. However, if you're in the private sector, which they don't do set asides, it's just strictly on your merits, strictly on your relationships, and strictly on the need in which you're solving for those corporations. We have companies that we've had for 20, 25, 30 years. And, that's because corporations don't have to go out to bid. If you're doing them a good job, you're performing the way they want you to perform, they don't even go out for bid. You hold these contracts for year after year after year. Maybe every now and then they may go and have a conversation with you about where you're at. Can you do any reductions or cost savings? But for the most part, it becomes a cookie cutter. And so when you're dependent on the government and the government changes their mind as to what they want to do, then all of a sudden you have to, you may be out of business. And many companies that in 8A, you found that the 8A program was very, good for negotiating and building some businesses. But when they got out of the 8A program, most of them failed because they didn't really understand the real game of an unsheltered market and was not able to actually survive in a competing market because it was not the way they were taught. So I say utilize anything that you can to get started, but as quickly as possible, you got to grow out of that. You don't want to stay small. You don't want to be a small business. You want to become a large business where those things don't matter and you're not affected by somebody's whim and changing a acronym, making you from just being a regular business to being an MBE or a DBE or SDBE or, all of these other acronyms that come and they go. And so just be who everybody else is and compete with everybody else. And believe it or not, it may not happen today, but you can learn the game enough to play and begin to be a real competitor. And now all of a sudden you're taking business from those who were just giving you business before.
So Steve, I know we talked about your business being a primary gasoline and fuel business, but reality is that you have charging station businesses and other enterprises that have made Hightowers Petroleum so successful here in the U.S. and around the world. One thing I want to talk about is the idea of going global. in your book, you talk a lot about globalization and your trade missions. Can you talk more about opportunities that we as business owners should consider when we're trying to go international to grow our business?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, many of us, if you look at just statistics across the board, most Black-owned businesses have 2 to 3 employees or less.
Yes, that's it.
Very few of them began to grow and reach out beyond their own communities, beyond their own state. I live in Middletown, Ohio. Our family's business was in Middletown, Ohio, and I've been said, why don't you move to Cincinnati? Why don't you move your business to Dayton? Why don't you move your business to Washington, D.C.? You know, where you sleep does not matter. All right. And the world is your platform. So, why would you limit yourself to a small geographic pinhole of any given city when you got the entire country, the entire world in which you can do business? And believe me, if you know how to do business, somebody in this world will do business with you. And that's been my mindset the whole time, is that it doesn't matter if you know how to build relationships and build value to a potential customer, then that customer will not just do business with you, they will find other ways to do business with you. I've been able to do that. And just to back up a little bit, my first foray into the continent of Africa was a trade mission that was sponsored by the state of Ohio.
Mhm.
Well, what I found is that when we arrived, there were people that were in, large businesses in those particular countries that, was there to be introduced to us. We did not have to go find them. Those kind of things were laid out by the Department of, International Trade in the Department of Commerce. Those are the kind of, rather than me just walking into Nigeria or walking into Ghana or walking into Cairo, Egypt, I was able to walk in with the backing of the U.S. government, being sanctioned as a business that the U.S. government has put forth. So they were interested in talking to me, as well as I now had very specific individuals to talk to. Well, I utilized that same method over and over again with the federal government, and went on several trade missions with the federal government several times throughout the continent of Africa. And that's how I began to meet people in South Africa, meet people in Ghana, meet people in Nigeria. That's where I met people like Aliko Dangote and Seyu Dendante, who runs the Dangote group of companies. Or look at um, Mrs. Mukokong, Dr. Anna Mukokong, which is the largest Black woman business in the continent of Africa, in South Africa, because I went where with the backing of the federal government, and eventually I was able to work my way into those relationships. So today I'm doing business with those same companies that I met years ago, but it takes those relationships and people understanding who you are, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in China. You cannot just show up one time and say, okay, I've got a relationship. I'm going to do $1 million or multi-millions of dollars of businesses. You got to go back and you've got to do things in those countries over and over again. And they got to get to know you. They got to know that you have ethics, that you're real, and that you're not just there for carpet bagging, but you're there to actually support and help educate the country, and kind of, give your skill sets in what we would call technology transfer some of your knowledge and skills to them. So today I'm doing business with these companies because I've known them for many, many years. And that's what you have to do. Even in the United States, you're not going to go to a company one time, knock on the door, and they're going to give you a contract.
No.
On an average, it's going to take you at least 7 times to go back before you actually get a contract. And I mean, that's just the national average in sales. So, things are not different, other than the fact that you're in a different culture. But people are people, and you got to learn how to navigate that.
Well, Steve, I know you've talked a lot about navigating your business as far as having a family owned business. We already know that most minority businesses only have between 1 to 5 employees. At the most, many of us have 10 employees at best. But you've been able to grow your family business by expanding and having your family and, of course, some associates and people you've met along the way to grow your business. Can you talk about that structure?
Well, we have about 55 employees. We have a construction division that my one son, Quincy, he heads that up. Another son, Stephen II, he heads up Hightowers Petroleum Company as the chief operating officer. I'm still president and CEO. Then I have a daughter who is the commercial officer and does all of over our bids and contracts. Stephanie, she's been with me from day one. And when I say day one, she was working in our office at 12, 13 years old, just like I worked in my business when I was 12 and 13 years old. She's the only one that never went away to do another job and come back. She just have been there from day one. And now at age 43, she is still very active and very knowledgeable and set in about every seat in the organization. So, that's how you begin to build. But in addition to that, I have a nephew who's the chief information officer, Jason. And then I have two granddaughters who one is in accounting as an associate and the other is in customer service as an associate. So Jasmine and Jadlyn, they're learning. They've both graduated from college and working now in the business as well. They're part of a team of about 50 employees that we have, and each of them, they're earning their way, such that you don't build a business and then when it's time to retire or something happens to you, you become disabled. They don't have to just jump into a situation where they don't know what's going on. They've already got the skill sets because they've learned how to do it. Now, also in my book, I say that, all family is not good for your business.
Okay, Steve, I know you've hired a lot of family members, but you've also fired some family members. For those of us who are considering scaling and growing our businesses, should we really hire our family to help us?
Well, I've had to fire my brothers, two of them, my sister, my mother, who was always in part of the business in the early days. She just kind of decided that she was going to leave, but it's because everybody don't see business as business,
Mhm.
and they're distracted by other things. And even though I we all grew up in a family with both parents. My mother and father was married for 67 years before she passed. And so it's not that everybody did not have the opportunity to have a good life per se, um, but they have different interests, and you cannot let your business go down because other people do not respect the business part and the responsibility of taking care of a customer, showing up on time, doing what you say you're going to do, and then also making sure that things that should happen, like paying your bills, are done.
Mhm.
And if it's a person from the outside or if it's a person from the inside, you cannot let them destroy your opportunity to grow your business. And so I had to become a loner within my own organization with myself and my father. And I once said that the last two people that would be in my business would be myself and my father. And of course, my kids were very, very young at that point in time.
Mhm.
Um, and then even your father, goes through a period of time where, he got sick. And last 5 years, he lived with myself and my wife. And at age 92, he just passed here this past year.
Oh.
So everybody's going to come and everybody's going to go. But you don't have to take that ride with individuals and people, whether it's family or not family, if they're not going to help support you in the manner in which it's going to help your goals and objectives begin to be met. And yes, sometimes you have to fire your kids. Sometimes you have to fire your family.
Mhm.
And if that has to happen, you have to be able to do that without being guilty or thinking that there's a responsibility that you have to let somebody destroy your business. You do not have to let someone destroy your business.
So, Steve, one thing we talked about is financing. Financing is really critical for any business. Of course, it's been critical for your company as well. But you also talked about in your book that companies, especially banks, were not friendly to Hightowers Petroleum. Can you talk about that area and the lockbox concept that you talked about? I don't think we really understand how to use lockboxes to our success. So, can you explain a bit more about that?
Well, 9 times out of 10, you're given the textbook of getting a business plan, getting a relationship with a banker, taking your business plan to that banker, and you should be able to get your funding that you're looking for, even if you've got the best plan in the world. And I did just that. I had projected how much sales I would have. I projected how, what customers I had and the customers I was going to have. I did all of that, and the bank still said no. And so, what are you going to do when you do all of that and the bank still says no? Well, that's where the lockbox is entered. And lockbox is a tool within every commercial bank, and it's typically managed by the treasury of that bank. And what in most relationship bankers are not going, they've never told me about that. It was actually a guy who that sold me my first load of fuel, and he was protecting himself, that told me how to do that. And that was for my customer, in that particular case was the state of Ohio, to send my payment to Hightowers Petroleum Company to a post office box, and actually went to the bank. The bank then had instructions on to pay my supplier. And so therefore, my supplier knew that if the agreement for the customer to send the money to this post office box inside the bank, and the bank was going to be the one who issues his payment to him, that he had security that he would be paid. And from that standpoint, the bank had no liability. They weren't giving me any loans. They were just transferring the payments as was instructed within their bank to pay the supplier. But
Right.
now you've got a company big enough that you got somebody who will be a number two player, and as long as they know that they can get paid, your business can continue to grow. Well, I use that concept over and over again with several different suppliers
Mhm.
coming into Lockbox. I had to get up all the way to $235 million in revenue before I got my first line of credit in
Wait,
the in a
hold
in a
on.
commercial bank.
We don't want to pass that point. You had to tell it one more time for everybody listening in the back.
We had to get up to $235 million in revenue when you really didn't need it anymore, before we got a first line of credit from a commercial bank. And that didn't come from Dayton or Cincinnati banks or Middletown banks. That came from a bank out of Columbus who came into the region and then looked at what we were doing, and gave us our first ABL account, asset based lending account, which was based on your receivables. But again, I would never have gotten to that point or been able to get the credit, because fuel is a credit adverse, risk adverse industry, even more so than banks. And in order in finding that tool was available, and you basically have created a line of credit without anyone taking the risk, but your customer who is big enough to pay their bills, then that is a tool that's available to everyone. Now, fast forward that to today, okay, almost. And I say almost today because I've even surpassed that. But the way I surpassed it was when you start needing $200 million worth of credit, all right, and you've got a customer that wants to buy fuel at that level. Now you're talking crude oil, in very large cargoes of fuel. There's a similar tool that allows them to issue a transferable letter of credit, which again, the letter of credit coming from your supplier, of your buyer, okay, issuing a transferable letter of credit to the bank. The bank has no liability. They do not actually give you the loan, but they have the ability to transfer that letter of credit to your ultimate producer or seller of the product. They shield that seller from actually knowing who my buyer is, who my buyer is. And so therefore, you basically created a very large lockbox, okay, that's typically called a DACA, or uh, which is the same tool at a very higher level than at a very small level. And so I've leveraged those kind of tools to because I could not get capital here in the U.S. Every the banks throughout the United States, they're private equity. You have to be in a little club and be introduced by somebody's uncle, aunt, whatever the case might be. And we didn't come from that. All right. And so therefore you have to be creative. And it's very important to know that you don't have to sit on the sideline, that there are tools and ways in which, if you really have the desire to go beyond what most people would say is possible and do the impossible, there are ways of getting there rather than saying that I can't, or I have to take it, right? Or I've got to take on a partner. And going back to even that today, now that we actually have a very substantial line of credit, I still own 100% of Hightowers Petroleum Company. And what I say to people, you do not have to give away all your equity and all your interest just because you need capital. Most of the time, and why I didn't do it very early on, because had I, the documents and paperwork that I had basically stated that, if I faltered or failed, that they could take over my company. Well, I fortunately had good advice from some of my suppliers to tell me that's what they're going to do, Steve. If you do not, make this particular payment, that they will take your company. So do you really want to put yourself in that position? And I backed off. That's again listening and learning from people who know a little bit more about finance and success and business than you do. And so I backed off and never did. I just hustled more. I just went out and got more contracts. I just knocked on more doors. I just went to more conferences. Those are the things that I did to get out of a hole when things were not going well. And I say in my book, there was a time when, my wife said that, Steve, you might need to go get a business. And my mother said, Steve, you might go get a business. My accountant said, you might go get a business. And when the IRS literally said to me, Steve, I think you need to go get a job. At that point in time, you're in trouble. Okay. Your books don't look good. But you know what? My father said, you know, just keep sticking in there. Let's keep going. And that word from my father at that particular time, when everybody had said I needed to go get a job, was a time where I just worked harder, I worked smarter, I worked longer, and I did those things that most people would never do in terms of sleepless nights, traveling all over the place to find opportunities, and work my way right out of it. And to this day, I still own 100% of my company, and we're doing well. We just actually got our first $1 billion contract here over the last couple months, and those things are possible because you have to have the energy, the desire. You've got to know what's possible, and you got to take the time that it takes. Most people don't realize how much time that I've actually spent on just this one sector to take my business from a $500 million company to get to $1 billion contract. May have taken 3 years of doing nothing but concentrating on that, while fortunately I had developed my internal structure to allow them to run the day-to-day operations of my business while I was able to be strategic and work on strategic growth in the global and international space. But I was successful in doing it because I didn't take no for an answer. And this one other thing, I even had to let my board of directors go because they said, just stay small. Just do your own core business. Don't worry about trying to get up there, because that altitude of business is not for small guys. It's for big corporations. And I did not take that for an answer because I had it in my soul and in my mind that I could. And I will say that I have accomplished it beyond what anyone would think and still have 100% of my business.
Steve, I'm so impressed that you're here today. I want to end the conversation with 4 key steps that you mentioned in your book. And I want to make sure I get them just right. So I'm going to read them as I look through and talk to you here directly. First, you want to find and develop a simple, reliable, indispensable service or product. Number 2, you said have a large customer base where you can have many opportunities to grow your business. For example, I know you have Kroger, you have AT&T, you have Duke Energy, FedEx, Waste Management, and many other customers. But you said to secure a supplier who's interested in filling orders with you. And lastly, you mentioned you can secure funding for your business as well. So I know you've got much more information in your booklet, but this is where I want to end today because you mentioned these tips in your book that are so important. Fueling from $0 to $1 billion is available on Amazon, and I hope everybody goes out and go get a copy of it. So Steve, you are the founder of Hightowers Petroleum. This is an opportunity for us to really just thank you for your time today. I am so happy years and years ago we met, and we've been able to keep this connection going. Steve, you have any final comments for those who are watching this podcast today?
Well, the one thing that I would say to any and everybody is that you have a choice every time that you start in a business, but the first choice is being committed to yourself and knowing that it's not going to be an easy road, but it is a road that you can achieve if you're willing to put in the time, have the heart, because again, your mind is going to tell you one thing, but it's going to take heart to go through sleepless nights and where you need payroll and payroll is not quite there, and you're going to need resources and resources that seem so far away. It takes a lot of tenacity. It takes a lot of heart in order to be successful, in order to achieve those goals. And one thing about it is that you cannot control the time. God is only the only person that controls time. Only thing that you can control is the energy and all of the conscious decisions that you make every day to be honest, to be persistent, to be diligent to make that success happen. God will take care of you if you take care of that. And that is what he gives to you in order for you to become successful.
Well, Steve, I've received that. You're the very first person on this podcast, and I'm so excited to have a chance to have you here today talking about your business that's available right now on Amazon. Go out and get it. It's an incredible book, and you've done an awesome job of really documenting your success over these 4 decades. Steve Hightowers, CEO of Hightowers Petroleum, our guest here on Frame the Business. I'm Dr. Alice Gordon Holloway. I will see you next time on my next podcast.